Heather Barr, thank you ever so much for talking Afghanistan with me today. Welcome to this episode of Afghanistan with Yakobi.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
So let's start with a bit of Heather Barr. You know, you've been such a strong proponent of uh, human rights, the rights of women in particular in Afghanistan. A lot of people know you, and your views are reflected on different media outlets throughout. Are interested in Afghanistan. But I suppose many people who listen to you, who read your views and admire you, they don't really know the person behind the tweets or the articles. So just talk about Heather Barr.
It's a hard question. I don't know. What do you want to know? I grew up on a fishing boat in Alaska. I ended up in Afghanistan by accident, kind of. I spent the earlier part of my career before law school working with homeless people in New York, after law school working with prisoners in New York. And then I got itchy feet and wanted to roam a bit further, went to the UK and studied human rights, and then joined the UN in a program where they just send you wherever they want to send you. You don't have any say at all over where you get sent. And so I went to Burundi
Hmm.
in Central Africa for almost 2 years. And then after your first assignment, you have some, you know people by then within the UN system. I was working for UNDP, and you can lobby for which country you want to go to. And so I thought that there were really fascinating sort of issues about sort of transition and justice in
Mm.
South Sudan and in Afghanistan. And so I said I'd like to go to South Sudan or Afghanistan, having never been to either of those countries. And so the program I was in meant that my position was funded by headquarters, which essentially made it a free position and a
Mm.
free extra staff member for whichever country office you went to. So obviously, most offices would say yes to having an extra free staff person. It wasn't because I was so special,
Mm.
but the Afghanistan. So both offices said yes, but Afghanistan replied faster.
Okay,
And
what was it that, when did Afghanistan register in your radar? When did you become kind of, how did do you remember when you first became interested in Afghanistan? How was it? I mean, was there kind of, yes, there's a country I want to go for?
Well, I mean, the first time I remember thinking about Afghanistan, it wasn't at all in the context of thinking this is a country that I would like to go and live in. It was 9/11, of course, and I was
Mm.
living in Lower Manhattan and watched
Ah.
the towers fall. And I was a prisoner's rights lawyer in New York, and our office was on Broadway in the Village. And I remember my colleagues and I we took all the bottles of water that we had in the office and took them down to the street and gave out glasses of water to people who were coming up from downtown from the trade center, and people were
Mm.
covered in dust, and some people were bloody, and people were flowing up the up Broadway as they tried to get away. And when we were saying to people, because the phones weren't working that day, and we were saying, look, you can come and use the phone in our office. Our landlines are working if you want to call your family. But our office was on the 10th floor, and a lot of people wouldn't get in the elevator because they were
Mm.
so frightened because they just escaped from the towers. So, and then 3 days later, my husband and I went to a peace vigil in
Mm.
Union Square. I think we all knew already that war was coming, but we didn't know where it would be yet. And then, of course, in the days that followed, we started seeing these images in the media of women in burqas, and there was Laura Bush's radio address. And it was clear immediately, even to someone like me who at the time didn't know a thing about Afghanistan, that that we were being told that we had to go and rescue Afghan women, and that
Mm.
was the story that was being told about this war that was about to happen. And so then, of course, it was 2007 when I actually ended up asking to go to Afghanistan through the UN and being sent there. And so I was in Kabul from 2007 until the end of 2013, full time, and then traveling back and forth afterwards.
I mean, for me, you talk about that day, and of course, you're right in the middle of it as a citizen in New York. I was a I was a child laborer, a refugee in Iran, in the birthplace of, in actual birthplace, the village of one of the founders of the Iran, Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Rafsanjani. So I was in Rafsanjan in a village working on a construction site. So it was a long day, hard labor, and of course that part of Iran becomes very, very hot. Even in November it's quite warm. So I was sent to go and buy some food stuff from one of the shops nearby after our day's work. So I went there, and one of the things I used to do in Iran, I talked to my children about it as well. And when we talk about snacks and things, there is a particular type of cookies that comes from Iran, and you can get them from here as well. And I get them, and I get one of them and take a can of Coke, and just sit somewhere and eat it, because that was one of the treats that I used to get myself. So I went to the shop and asked for, a bottle of Coke, and then one of those cookies. So I was standing there while waiting to eat my cookies and then get the food stuff that we need. There was a small TV, I think a 14-inch Sony TV, one of those boxy ones behind the counter on the wall. So it was kind of looked like as if it was hanging from the ceiling, but it was just mounted there. And there are planes hitting the tall buildings. I'd never seen something like that. Because of course I'd not I thought it might be a movie scene or something like that, and it really didn't register with me when I bought all that eggs and bread or whatever it was. So I went to back to where we were living and switched on the radio. So we had a radio with us as well. So small, pocket radios that you'd listen to BBC Persian, and that it really broke, and that what had really happened, the magnitude of the thing. But of course, being a 13, 14-year old, it didn't really register how what it meant. But I remember days later, when days and weeks later, when the the uh, the operation in Afghanistan finally began, I was walking past, midday. I remember there was this farmer with his tractor driving past me, and he suddenly stopped and he said, "Afghan boy," and I just looked at me and I said, "Yes." So America's attacked Afghanistan. And I knew what that meant. I just fell onto my knees, started crying, because I thought, yeah, I can get home. That is the moment that your world in New York had changed, and the world of a child refugee laborer in a village in Iran had changed as well. So such was the magnitude of change. But we've all been living the consequences of those days. So, and how was, your first encounter with Afghanistan like?
Um, I mean, I was coming from Burundi. Like I
Yeah.
literally like got on a plane and
Mm.
flew from Burundi to Afghanistan. So I suppose in a way that was my frame of reference. But I mean, I remember flying in over the mountains.
Yeah.
And I'm from a place with mountains too, of course. And I looked down at the mountains and I thought,
And
oh, there
very
aren't any.
pristine, very pristine.
Alaska is, yes, and Afghanistan too. I thought there aren't any trees on the mountains. That's very strange, because in Alaska the mountains are very green. But no, I mean, it's an overwhelming place to find yourself. It's very, very different from anywhere else I'd ever been. And Kabul was yeah, it was hard to it's a hard place to find your way around in a way. Like there's no
Mm.
street signs, there's but I felt immediately sort of, welcomed and fascinated. I mean, I worked in this office of some really amazing colleagues. There were foreign colleagues, but many more Afghan colleagues. And it's interesting you talk. And there was a woman who was my boss when I first came to Afghanistan. And she's Afghan, and she described to me watching 9/11 on a television as a refugee in Pakistan, and saying, that as she watched it, they all knew that their lives would change, but that this would change their lives, but they didn't know how. And yeah, and here we are, 23 years later, thinking
And
about.
what did your work, what was your job and your work involved in Afghanistan at the time? So you went to Kabul, familiarized yourself with the city, with its people, and how did you deal with A, what was the work, and B, the culture shock?
Yeah, so the work was about I was helping. I was kind of a deputy to an assistant country director who was running a program on human rights and women's rights and democracy. So we had a bunch of different projects that UNDP was implementing. They were working on the election. They were trying to help the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with their human rights reporting obligations. They were trying to build local courthouses and do capacity building with Ministry of Justice and the Attorney General's office and so on. So it was that kind of sort of usual UN kind of capacity building programming, and that's a whole thing, sort of watching how things were done in that time, and um and how very driven by foreigners so much
Yeah,
of what was happening in that time was, and these kind of dynamics between the government and their so-called helpers,
yeah.
which were complicated and difficult. And I ended up after 2 years with UNDP, I ended up moving over to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, where I was hired to run their anti-corruption program, and I did that from 2009 to 2011, and
I bet you
and
had
that
your
was
hands full. Bet you had.
well, I mean, it's a grim thing to joke about, but yeah, talk about one of the least successful programs ever. But anyway, and then my boss left that job, and so I ended up doing his job for a while. So that was a broader set of work around helping with legislative drafting. We were involved in some of the work on the law and elimination of violence against women, the criminal procedure code, the new penal code, all of these laws, which spent there were many thousands and thousands of hours that went into drafting these laws, which essentially no longer exist to a large extent. Particularly, of course, the eval law. Um, so yeah, that's what the work was, and
And then you
much of it, much.
joined in 2011. You joined Human Rights Watch.
Yeah, that's right. So the UN and I were never the greatest fit, to be honest. Like I struggled with a lot of things with how the UN worked. And so when the Human Rights Watch job in Afghanistan opened up, I jumped at it, and I've been there ever since, which is a long time now.
And how was kind of, apart from the professional work in Afghanistan being, challenging given all that was happening, but how was living in Kabul for a Western woman? An Alaskan girl, I suppose, in Kabul.
I mean, there were great things about it and there were difficult things about it. I mean, I think looking back, I mean, one thing that makes me a bit sad is how segregated we were from Afghans, or we allowed ourselves to be from Afghans. There was this whole kind of expat life, and it was not very integrated at all with the the real community in Kabul. And that, I could sort of give you reasons that was the case, and some of it was to do with security restrictions, and some of it was to do with people drinking alcohol and other people not drinking alcohol, and
Yeah.
and so on. But so yeah, so there was a kind of lively expat life, but it wasn't that connect, but it was quite a bubble. People talked about it as a bubble, and it was a bubble. So um
So there's kind of
but
two parallel worlds being lived in Kabul at the same time. And I suppose many parallel worlds, given the way Afghanistan was. So there was, people at the low end of society, and then people, the burgeoning middle class, which become ever more powerful or come into being after the international intervention. And you had this young, enthusiastic, increasingly educated uh, generation who demanded ever more and brimming with
Mhm,
ideas.
mhm,
But of course, there was kind of this contradiction of different demands from different sectors, from different parts of society. Afghanistan was just this contradiction going forward in a sense. It did eventually hit a brick wall, but you had your own parallel world. This section of society had their own parallel worlds. The people in the village being kind of, I suppose, more and more controlled by the Taliban had their own parallel world,
mhm.
and it really never meshed. I mean, is that the right way of putting it?
Well, I think part of what's really heartbreaking is that I think you started to see some of that breaking down as time went on. I think you started to see that there was this like group of young, sort of young Afghan kind of movers and shakers who,
Mm,
really like had this kind of these kind of big visions for the future, and there were different iterations of that, and people from the government and people from the private sector and so on, and you started to see more integration, sort of between that group of Afghans and some of the expat socializing and lives and whatever, and one of the things I was really struck by, I didn't go back for a year or two, and then I went back in March, April 2021. And that was the first time I remembered meeting young Afghan women who were living on their own,
mm,
who'd like gone out and rented an apartment and were living in the way that young women have lived, for a long time, the way that I lived in my 20s in New
yeah.
York City. Well, I didn't have my own apartment because that wasn't affordable in New York, but you know what I mean. And I thought, oh, that's really different. That's really new, that's really like this kind of different way of living that changes society over time, and of course that's gone too now. I think you'd be very brave and very quiet about it if you were a woman living on your own in Kabul these days, and probably not very safe either.
There was this thing. I mean, I last went to, so I made two trips to Afghanistan, 2018 and 20 in April 2021. And the last time I went there was this cafe in Kabul. It's called Cupcake. You've probably heard of it. It's such a beautiful place to go for a coffee, and I loved its cupcakes. Not cupcakes, cheesecakes. I loved its cheesecakes. So you had the two-story. So you'd go up, a kind of a balcony-esque kind of place, and you look at the street outside. The first time I went to that place, and one of her friends were with me, and he said, "Look, one of the things you have to remember: never sit near a window, because if something blows up, you'll be killed by the shattered glasses." So one of the days I was meeting a friend and I went on, sat on that second floor, looking down the window. There are a couple of boys who were shoe polishing, and you see them all over Kabul, and it was just such grim picture. And then there were a couple of young. There was a kind of there was a young couple sitting the desk near me, on the table near me, and as I went and sat there, they thought, he looks somebody local, maybe. I was not looking like somebody who'd come from the West. So I was just sitting there, waiting for my friend to turn up. And these two poor souls, I thought, okay, yeah, well, they were on a date or something. So, the guy was trying to impress this girl, and they looked at me, said, "Oh, let's switch to English. He may not understand what we're saying in English." And one of the and they started talking. The young man started to talk about trying to impress this woman, and that how much he knew about philosophy, Western philosophy, he knew about Descartes, he knew about, and then he went on about, he wanted to show off as if he was like a proper intellectual. That kind of brings you that youth, the enthusiasm that they had for education and knowledge, I suppose. That generation that brought up. So he was trying to really hard to come up with ideas from, the great Persian poets, the Hafez, the Rumi, and then linking them to Western philosophy, to Greeks. And then he went on, on a kind of a story about, he was trying to translate, I suppose, uh, Plato's cave allegory. And he was going the wrong way about it. And in English.
I wonder if there was another date after this one.
And I'm just sitting there, somebody who had returned from the West who could speak English fluently, but I just sat there and said, poor souls. And and I'm looking down the window and you see two young kids, waiting for somebody to give them a look and, give them some business, I suppose, to polish their shoes. So this was Afghanistan in a nutshell for me. There are two couples trying to impress each other with Western philosophy, and then there were a young kid, waiting for somebody to give them a few Afghani rupees, I suppose, or Afghanese, for them to make a living out. So that was, I suppose, Kabul.
So we were only ever a team of like two people working for Human Rights Watch in Kabul. But I used to go across the street or down the road after the Bukhari went out at night and go and work in Flower Street Cafe.
Yeah.
And Flower Street Cafe was always full of people on dates. And I loved it. I thought, this is a sort of a new kind of freedom, and people are seizing it, to date.
Yes. And now going, I suppose, take it a bit back to, the whole thing falling apart in August 21. Where were you, and how did, the whole thing, when falling apart, how did you experience it?
Yeah, so I'd been a bit disconnected for the last couple of years because my boss had quit and I'd ended up doing her job. This is a thing that happens to me often in my career. And so I had been running the women's rights division at Human Rights Watch together with a colleague for the last couple of years, and I'd still managed to sneak in that trip to Afghanistan in April 2021. But I'd been doing a lot of budgets and fundraising and things like that. And then my new boss, who took over as the head of the women's rights division, had started in late July, and I had taken a long vacation. I'd gone off to Alaska and to Maine and to New York, and sort of traveling around and not very much on the internet. And then flew back to Islamabad. And as you might know, all flights to Islamabad land in the middle of the night. And
Yeah.
so I landed with my daughter at about 1 a.m. on August 15th.
Hmm.
And I turned on my phone, and I had a sense that things had not been going well over the previous weeks. But I think, so many people didn't really realize, even like a week beforehand, how quickly this could all go. And so I turned on my phone as the plane landed at 1 or 2 a.m. on the 15th, and it was clear that that things had turned a corner. And I fell asleep for a few hours, and when I woke up, Ghani had fled.
Yeah.
And that was it. And I'm sure, everyone who cares about Afghanistan has a story, of course, about the days that followed. And I'm sure you have, your own terrible and difficult story, and the stories of people like me are nothing like those of Afghans, but we have our own stories too, of people who owe Afghanistan a lot, who who have a lot of of important connections with people there. And so, friends in the airport, friends trying to get to the airport, friends deciding whether they could get to the airport, friends adrift, and a million frantic phone calls and all
Mm,
of that, and just and most yeah, I mean, not most distressingly, it's impossible, but one of the things that was so incredibly hard was not being able to offer the help that people needed, like just this overwhelming need from, like, everyone you'd ever met, people who were close to you, people you'd met once, people who'd gotten your email somehow, people who'd gotten your WhatsApp, people you'd never met, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people asking for help, and having so little that you could do to actually help, and some of the people who, I mean, there are a lot of people who like quit their jobs and sort of became full-time, people working on evacuations, people who spent their own savings, people who worked 24 hours a day for, and people who are still doing it. And I've got so much respect for and gratitude for the people who've done that. But it's absolutely enraging that, that it's people like that, sometimes ex-soldiers, ex-aid
mm.
workers who seem to be the heart of this evacuation operation, not the governments that actually have obligations to the people who are at risk now. And it's also so frustrating that it felt from a lot of these governments, including the UK, the US, others, like, okay, we did this big push and now it's done, when the crisis is not done, is it? We see that the crackdown, particularly on women and girls, is ongoing. The need to flee is ongoing. The number of people who are being forced to flee is continuing to increase. And the response to that is just not there.
And was it personal? I
Of
mean,
course. I mean, what do you mean?
I mean, in a sense that you'd spend so much of your time in Afghanistan, decades, more than a decade, trying to make a difference. To see all of that go into dust in a matter of days, how did it feel? When I say was it personal, I mean, how did it affect you personally, emotionally?
Um, I don't know. I mean, it's not about me. It can't be about me, It's
Hmm.
I get on a plane and leave. I can go and
Yeah.
live in America. I can live in the UK. Like it's and I feel like the work that we did there, you know, it hasn't vanished completely, I think that, I think this about, like, the the situation of women and girls. One of the things that you can't take away is the education that's already in people's heads, the
Mm,
ideas that are already in people's heads. And I think that that's what you see coming out in all the different kinds of resistance
mm.
that you have by Afghan women and girls, and the ways in which they are really sort of leading the opposition to the Taliban. I think, in the same way, like all the work that um that my Afghan colleagues did in the different organizations that were operating, the different movements that came together. None of that has disappeared. All of
Mm.
that is still in people's brains and in people's relationships and networks, and in the plans that people are making and will make for the future in Afghanistan, when there's an opportunity for that future.
And but you've not really given up. I really barely a day goes by without seeing Heather Barr saying something substantial about the situation of women in Afghanistan, and it gets picked up by media outlets which are focused on Afghanistan. And where does that come from? That it's kind of you can see your tweets, your articles, your opinions as very conviction driven. So I suppose, shall I say, conviction driven tweets?
That's a kind way of putting it. Well, I mean, I'm incredibly lucky and incredibly privileged to, have a job where, it's my job to advocate for women's rights, to be with an organization that has a strong platform from which to do that work. So, that's an incredible gift that I'm lucky enough to have. In terms of giving up, Afghan women don't have any option to give up, do they?
Mm.
And so how dare we, as long as there's a chance to stand beside them and be helpful to them somehow. And yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing I would say is that, um, so the Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch is about 15 people maybe
Mm.
trying to work on women's rights issues. And I should say that I moved over from being the Afghanistan researcher for the organization to working for the Women's Rights Division a long time ago in 2014, actually. So since 2014, my focus has been on women's rights specifically, and not always in Afghanistan. I've worked on other countries too. But with that scarce resources, with 15 people trying to look at women's rights in the entire world, why would we devote so much time and energy to Afghanistan? And the answer is that we think that Afghanistan has global consequences for women's rights. Absolutely. So I'm working on Afghanistan. I have a colleague named Sahar Fetrat who works
Yeah.
with me, who's from Afghanistan, who also is deeply involved in this work. And our
And of
director
course,
has,
Firishta Abbasi, who's a great
Mhm.
friend of mine, and who's
Yeah.
doing the job he used to do.
Exactly. So she's with a different part of the organization, with the Asia division, but the reason that our women's rights director has given us this much space to work on Afghanistan is exactly for this reason, that we think that the the situation for women and girls in Afghanistan, and even more so, the international response to the situation for women and girls in Afghanistan has global consequences for women's rights.
Mm.
On August 15th, 2021, the bar for how bad things could be for women and girls globally got much worse all of a sudden. And that really has huge consequences. And if the world can kind of move on and go, oh well, it's Afghanistan, what can you do, then that really has the potential to help erode women's rights elsewhere as well. And I think we see other groups in other countries, not necessarily being inspired by the Taliban, because misogyny,
Mm.
was not invented by the Taliban. It was already there in lots of places, and of course we have 0 countries so far that have achieved gender equality. But I think we do see groups that share the Taliban's worldview and the Taliban's view on women and girls being inspired, being emboldened, I should say not inspired, but being emboldened by the Taliban, and feeling like, let's go for it. We can totally do it. Like, these guys are being treated as if they're a legitimate government, even though
Mm.
they've, imposed the most
But the
abusive
the, the counter
anti-women policies in the world.
the counter argument to that, I suppose, is that's been made by people in the West as well, as that it's in many ways identical to what the argument the Taliban are making. What we're doing to women is part of our culture. Our culture demands that we do these things to women. And then the identical argument that some people in the West makes is, well, look at them. It's their culture. We did our best. We spent trillions of dollars, worth of blood and treasure. It didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is because that's what these people are. We can't change that. And what would you say to that?
Well, I mean, that's a deeply sort of Orientalist and racist viewpoint, isn't it? And yes, and we hear Orientalist and racist statements a lot in discussions about Afghanistan. I mean, I've been particularly frustrated by some of these discussions where people sort of kind of dismiss Afghan women's rights defenders, saying, oh, they're all foreign funded. They were the Kabul elites. They were foreign funded, et cetera, et cetera. They never represented, the real Afghanistan, the authentic Afghanistan, the Afghans in the village. And I just think it's such transparent nonsense that, because I would really say to the people who've made those arguments, go to any village, pick a village, any village, anywhere in Afghanistan, any region, any province, any ethnic group you like. Pick a girl or a woman, any girl, any woman, and go and talk to her and ask her, like, would she like to study or be able to send her daughters to go and study? If she's a woman, would she like to have the opportunity to go to the market freely when she wants to and move around and do whatever she needs to do, and also see her friends and see her family? And would she like to be able to get a job and earn a living and earn a wage if she needs to, I mean, these are just basic things that everyone wants. There's nothing foreign funded or Kabul elite about wanting to have access to healthcare and access to education and access to employment and to be treated like a full human. And this is what the Taliban have taken away from people, is not only all of these specific rights, but also this broader sense of being perceived as fully human.
Yeah, and the the Taliban's treatment of women and girls in particular have been termed as gender apartheid. Now, you're based in South Africa, and do you see the potential for a push, at least an organized push by human rights defenders and with political support from sympathetic political actors in the West, to really push for a formal recognition of what's going on in Afghanistan as legally gender apartheid, which will have implications for the group's leadership in the long term?
So that push is already happening. The United Nations is in the process of considering a new draft treaty on crimes against humanity. And there's a whole, these processes are very complicated and long, but there was a debate that happened in the fall in something that's called the Sixth Committee at the UN about this treaty. And there will be another debate that will happen in April about that draft treaty. And actually, just this morning, someone has sent me a summary of the written comments that states submitted after the debate that happened in the fall. And so 30 countries have submitted written comments with their thoughts on the treaty. And out of those 30 sets of comments, 6 of them specifically call for adding gender apartheid to the treaty. So they call for amending the definition of apartheid, which is in the draft treaty, to say that apartheid can be committed not just on the basis of race, but also on the basis of gender. And, obviously that law, that treaty, if it was adopted, would apply to every country in the world. But of course, a lot of this discussion has been driven by the way in which, a lot of legal experts feel that the situation in Afghanistan has illustrated that is a gap in the current international law that exists today. That's not the only strategy that people are pursuing. Of course, people are also pushing for the International Criminal Court to bring prosecutions about the situation in Afghanistan, and for those prosecutions to include prosecution of people who have engaged in what the International Criminal Court calls gender persecution. And, it's been a very, very long wait for Afghans for action from the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court has been looking into the situation in Afghanistan since 2006. And I think it's been quite painful for people to see like yeah, sort of a really prompt response from the ICC in Ukraine and Israel. And when there's been such a very, very long and slow, drawn out process in Afghanistan, there had been some hope that there might be indictments by the end of last year. Obviously, we've passed that that time frame as well now, but there's still, there's still a lot of attention focused on the ICC. Another thing that people are looking at is the potential of bringing a case in the International Court of Justice. So this is, sort of sometimes referred to as the World Court. And in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, if you take a look at the convention, if you read down to the very last article in the convention, it says that if a country is violating their obligations under the CEDAW Convention, another state can bring an action against them in the International Court of Justice. And so there are some lawyers that have been working on trying to figure out how another country or countries might bring such a case. And that's something that may happen as well.
The current era has been termed by some, I think it was the phrase was first coined by the former British Foreign Secretary David Miliband, the age of impunity. And we really are in the age of impunity. You look at anywhere in the world, from Putin to Netanyahu to Hamas leadership to Iran Ayatollahs to to Sudan and elsewhere, you go people with gross violations of human rights getting away with it. Because I think, do you feel that the world has become a place where a certain level of violations are tolerated? Things like what is happening to women in Afghanistan, to other ethnic groups, the Hazaras, the Tajiks, and the Uzbeks, and some Pashtuns who are against the Taliban. And they're glossed over in the interest of political and geopolitical expediency. That all the things that we're trying to do to drag attention to Afghanistan will not amount to anything.
I mean, I certainly think that we're in a volatile and dangerous time. And I think that, yeah, we see in some ways like an erosion in the respect for human rights and for the kind of framework of international law that upholds human rights. But I don't feel that all is lost. I feel that, we have to fight against that. And I feel that, we're seeing some leadership by some smaller countries, some unexpected countries. We have to remember that when it comes to the General Assembly and things like that, every state has an equal vote. So if you're
But not an equal say, not an equal say.
Well, that's the Security Council, and there's an interesting discussion going on about whether the Security Council should be reformed because it is so lopsided in that way and has so often led to deadlock in these very politicized times. And Afghanistan, of course, is one of many issues that have been very politicized in the Security Council. But I think we do see some states stepping forward and sort of speaking up in important ways. I mean, you may have seen that South Africa has brought a case against Israel in the International Court of Justice. And there's a bit of a record developing now of countries, bringing cases there or intervening in cases there and having their say and not saying, oh, well, I'm not one of the permanent members of the Security Council, so nobody cares what I have to say, but feeling like, no, you are going to care about what I have to say. You look at like the way that some of the Pacific countries have been raising their voices in the discussions about the climate crisis, and you see that countries are insisting on being heard and have a right to be heard. So I think the landscape is changing on human rights, but that doesn't mean that it's all lost. And going back to Afghanistan, I feel deeply, deeply frustrated by what I think has been a pretty lousy international response to the crisis there, and particularly a relatively apathetic response to the crisis that women and girls are facing. But that doesn't mean that all is lost either,
But does it not make you feel that, with all the statements that you make, all the work that you do, Does it not feel for you that you're shouting in a void?
Mm, no, it's not a void because it's full of Afghan women who are shouting, and I'm standing next to them and trying to shout along with them, and we do see impact. We do,
Mm.
so for example, I'll just give you one example. Um, at the very end of December, the Security Council passed a resolution following up on this assessment report, which came out in November.
Mhm.
That back in the spring, that the Security Council asked the Secretary General to commission this assessment on the way forward in Afghanistan. There was a lot of discussion around, how that process went and who was consulted and whether their views were included and whether it was sort of presenting a path toward recognition for the Taliban. But anyway, so this resolution, the first version of it really said very, very little about human rights and about women's rights. And there was a bunch of mobilizing around that, and a bunch of people in New York sort of bothering the states that are members of the Security Council and saying this draft is not okay. You can't do this. And even though it was Christmas time, at the last minute, the three states that I think really stepped up in this particular situation were France, Malta, and Switzerland. And they got involved, and the resolution's still not great, but it's a lot better than it was before they got involved. And that was a direct result of advocacy by Afghan women. Shahrazad Akbar briefed the Security Council in those last days of December and made a really powerful case. But her work also, her comments were drawing on work that had been done by others. Lots of people had put together different statements responding to the assessment report. Drops that is run by Mariam Safi had put together a whole shadow report on the assessment report. So I think you see that there's a lot of different work going on, and work that honestly like bridges some of these schisms that people sometimes I think overemphasize within the community of Afghans. And it does have an impact, even though the impact is usually less than you would hope for.
Um, Now, if you were to draw a simple roadmap for what needs to be done and steps need to be taken and taken quickly, what would those be?
Hmm. Well, I think that, you know, one of the most fundamental issues is about women's participation.
Hmm.
So Security Council Resolution 1325 says that women have to be full participants in all peace processes, and that also means all important discussions about the future of their country. And that principle has been violated again and again and again with regard to Afghanistan. It was violated in the Doha negotiations. It was violated, for example, last spring when the Secretary General held this important envoys meeting. And there's another envoys meeting, which is coming up, likely, perhaps as early as this month. And we need to fight again to say you can't consult women by Zoom the day before. You can't, like consult them afterwards. They have to actually be full participants in the room, in the meeting, with at least as much status as the Taliban, and really more. And so I think that's the first thing that has to happen. I mean, the solutions shouldn't come from me. The solutions should come from the Afghan women who are there in the room making decisions. And that's where I think the international community keeps getting it wrong. And there are so many excuses that we hear from diplomats for why that's the case, and there's I think there are a lot of really sort of disingenuous narratives about, oh, well, the diaspora women can't, represent the women in the country, and the women in the country can't represent themselves because they can't travel and they can't get a visa. And it's just all really unhelpful. And it's a form of sexism that honestly we see in every crisis situation. It's the same list of excuses that are always used for ignoring 1325 and not including women. And I guess one thing I should say also is that intersectionality is a term that feminists use a lot and have used for several decades now, and it's very relevant when it comes to Afghanistan. When we talk about like which women need to be in the room, which women need to be heard from. You know, for example, there's this discussion about appointing a new special envoy, and
Mm.
we've been arguing that if there's going to be a new special envoy, it's got to be someone with like real credibility on human rights, including women's rights. It's got to be someone, that person has to have a mandate that includes being in consultation with Afghan women. And they should have a gender advisor as part of their team working full time on that. And in terms of, you know, consulting with Afghan women, it's got to be a whole range of Afghan women. It can't be a hand-picked sort of set
But
of
that has
Afghan.
led, that a handful of Afghan, there's a suppose a kind of a, you sometimes feel, Afghanistan still, classes is still a thing in Afghanistan as well. Which family you belong to still a thing as well. It's very, very much a thing now. And, that's played out in the way the Taliban deals with women as well. And there has been a lot of controversy. Many women have come forward to criticize and strongly criticize certain women whom they believe to be Taliban apologists, demanding because of the gender, trying to show a kind of trying to, I suppose, gloss over some of the Taliban's abuses of women, while at the same time demanding for better and deeper and greater international engagement with the Taliban. So, for women who are suffering and advocating, campaigning, those women are apologists. But for those women, their opponents are sellouts to the West. So yeah, it all plays in the hands of the Taliban. They I suppose feel that they've got women and the international community and all the ethnic groups in the right place that they want them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that yeah, I mean it's music to the Taliban's ears when, you know, when foreign diplomats are sort of throwing up their hands and saying, oh, well, you know, like we can't make sense of this. Let's just ignore all of them, which I think is often the reaction. I think I always go back to um, the protesters, the women who are in Afghanistan and who are really risking absolutely everything to come out on the streets and protest. And
Mm.
I think that as long as those women are still raising their voices and still protesting and still you know, facing the incredibly brutal retaliation from the Taliban that they are,
And the
you
very,
know,
these this very week that we are recording this, the Taliban have been rounding up hundreds of women in Kabul because they've been imprisoning them, kidnapping them, and these women. I think there will be a tomorrow, and I believe so. There will be a tomorrow of Afghanistan without the Taliban. But these women should be remembered as real heroes who really made it happen.
yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we keep trying to convey to diplomats is that this isn't a crisis that happened and now women and girls are living with it. It's a crisis that's continuing to deepen and that's ongoing. So we see that the Taliban keep coming out with new policies that further violate the rights of women and girls. But what we also see, which is less visible, is that the enforcement of the existing Taliban policies continues to intensify. So I
Mm.
think the experience of women and girls is not that like these horrible rules have been put in place and now they have to live with them. It's that it's an ever changing, ever worsening set of rules, which are decided, you know, at the national level, the provincial level, the local level, the level of your own particular street and the particular guy who's at the checkpoint at the end of your road, perhaps, you know, who comes up with a new rule every week about, you know, how you're supposed to be dressed or whether you can have a phone or
Mm.
whether you can leave your house without a mahram or all of these different things. And so life is not only incredibly constricted and prison-like, but in this volatile, unpredictable, ever worsening way.
Um, no, it's fascinating listening to you. I'm really grateful that we're doing this. So let's end this with sort of, I suppose, a beat note. let's, as you know, I tend to ask our guests to, if they've worked in Afghanistan, share upbeat stories, some things that make them, when you have your moments of reflections on Afghanistan, things that make you smile about the country, that make you hopeful, stories, stories of your life in Kabul, something that comes to your mind readily available when you think about good days. Just share that.
Hmm. Um, yeah, I mean, some of the days when it was possible to like get out of the city and go and walk around in the countryside and just feel relaxed and free and have a picnic and look at the natural beauty and whatever. I mean, it's interesting. My daughter is 9 and she she
Well,
lived for
minus 10, and she's been away for a day, so they're away for a 5-day school trip, and we just so I'm looking at my wife's face, and she's looking at me. We've got the kind of teary eye. Oh my God!
Aw. Well, it's a lovely age. But so she lived in Pakistan for 4 years and of
Mm,
course um you know, there were always people from Afghanistan, people working on Afghanistan coming through our house, and particularly after the Taliban takeover, we had journalists coming and staying with us on their way in, on their way
mm.
out of Afghanistan, and so she said, like that she wants to go to Afghanistan, and like she asked, can she go there with us, and of course, the answer for the moment is no, but I dream of a day when we can go on a road trip together as a family, and I'd love to like drive around the ring road and see places that it was never possible to see during the years that I lived there because the security situation was so difficult. But yeah, I dream of a tele of a yeah, I dream of a time when there's neither the oppression that's happening now, nor the security, um, horrors that were so serious in the years before. Afghans deserve to live without either of these things, and I believe that they will. And I think that there are young people inside the country and outside the country who are demanding that future, and they're going to get it eventually.
And how much of the languages did you pick? Farsi and Pashto.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm a typical American. I'm really terrible at languages, so I'm not gonna lie to you.
So did you travel outside Kabul? Did you go to places like Bamyan, for example? I mean, did you see the Bamyan?
Yeah, yeah, I've been to Bamiyan a few times. What a magical place, and also to Banda Amir.
Uh,
So yeah, but never by road because during the times when I was there, it wasn't possible to travel on that road. But yeah, no, I traveled not as much as I would have liked to, but yeah, to Mazar and Jalalabad and Herat a few times and Kandahar and so, but there's so many parts of the country that I haven't seen that I dream about seeing one day.
and on those beautiful, inspiring, and hopeful dreams, Heather Barth, thank you ever so much for talking Afghanistan. We've been really grateful for your time.
Thank you.